What if the person you least expected to save your life was someone you never even noticed? People like Eleanor Whitmore, billionaires, untouchable, living in luxury, don't cross paths with kids like Jamal, invisible, struggling, surviving one day at a time. But in one split second, everything changed. A homeless boy threw himself into danger to save a woman who had everything. And when she asked how she could repay him, his answer left her in tears. This is not the story you think it is. It's not about charity. It's about a choice that changed two lives forever. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll never see kindness the same way again. The cold wind of Hollowbrook cut through the streets like an invisible blade, making people pull their coats tighter, walk faster, and keep their heads down. No one wanted to linger in the open, not in this city where time was money, and no one had either to spare. The towering skyscrapers of Westbury Avenue stood like silent gods, their reflective glass exteriors mirroring a world where luxury reigned supreme. But beneath them, in the shadows of alleys and abandoned storefronts, there was another world, one most chose to ignore. Jamal Carter had learned a long time ago that people only saw what they wanted to see. A 12-year-old black kid in an oversized hoodie and sneakers that barely held together. Invisible. A child sitting on the cold pavement, watching the parade of tailored suits and high heels pass by. Just another fixture of the city. No different from a cracked sidewalk or a flickering streetlight. But Jamal saw everything. He saw the hurried steps of businessmen who wouldn't meet his gaze, the way women clutched their purses tighter when he walked too close, the way store owners sighed when he lingered too long by their windows, as if his presence alone was bad for business. Hunger had a way of sharpening your senses. It made you aware of things other people missed, the smell of fresh bagels wafting from a cafe, the half-eaten sandwich someone tossed into the trash, the jingling of spare change in the pockets of people who never thought to offer any. He had spent the night behind a shut-down laundromat on Harper Street, curled up beneath layers of cardboard. The cold was merciless, slipping through every gap, biting at his fingers and toes until they felt numb. He didn't sleep much, he never did. Sleep made you vulnerable, and out here vulnerability could get you robbed, beaten, or worse. So, at the break of dawn, he was already moving, hands stuffed in his pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind, making his way toward Madison Square, the cheer of them. And yet Eleanor never looked at the city the way she had when she was younger. Now it was nothing more than numbers on reports, properties on spreadsheets. Her assistant, Heather, sat beside her, rattling off the day's schedule. You have the investors' luncheon at noon, then a meeting with the mayor's office regarding the new development on Ridgeway Drive. Your dinner reservation with the Singapore delegates is confirmed for 8. Eleanor barely listened. Her fingers scrolled through her phone, eyes scanning emails that blurred together into a meaningless stream of demands. She had everything, wealth, power, influence, but somewhere along the way, she had stopped feeling the thrill of it. When had success become just another routine? The car pulled up at a stoplight on Madison Square, and Eleanor exhaled, rubbing her temples. She needed coffee, maybe 2. "I'll walk from here," she said abruptly. Heather blinked. "Ma'am, are you sure?" Eleanor didn't walk anywhere. People like her didn't just stroll through the city, but today she wanted to. "I'll meet you at the office," she said, stepping out onto the sidewalk before her assistant could protest. The cold air hit her immediately, but she welcomed it. She pulled her coat tighter and started walking, heels clicking against the pavement. She barely noticed the boy standing near the traffic light. Jamal saw her though, rich, powerful, untouchable. He could spot them a mile away. And in a matter of seconds, her life would be in his hands. A distant roar of an engine made Jamal glance up. The car was coming too fast. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. Across the street, Eleanor stepped onto the crosswalk, distracted by the buzz of a new email on her phone. She didn't see the silver sedan hurtling toward her, the driver barely paying attention. But Jamal saw, and in that instant, something inside him snapped. He wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about what came next. He just ran. "Hey, watch out!" Eleanor barely had time to turn her head before something crashed into her. A force knocked her off balance, sending her sprawling onto the pavement. Her phone flew from her hands, skidding across the sidewalk. The car sped past, missing her by inches. Jamal hit the ground hard, elbows scraping against concrete, his breath knocked from his lungs. For a second, everything was still. Then Eleanor gasped, rolling onto her back, her heart pounding like a war drum. People around them had stopped, murmuring, staring. Some pulled out their phones, but no one moved to help. She turned her head and saw him. The boy. He was breathing heavily, his hoodie slightly torn from the fall, but his eyes were locked on her. She blinked, reality settled in. He had saved her. A street kid had just risked his life for a woman who had walked past hundreds like him without a second glance. The weight of that realization hit her like a tidal wave. For the first time in years, Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who had built an empire, who had dined with the wealthiest, who had been untouchable, was looking into the eyes of someone she had never noticed before. And for the first time in his life, Jamal Carter wasn't invisible. The city didn't stop. Cars honked, pedestrians kept moving, and conversations continued as if nothing had happened. But for Eleanor Whitmore, time had frozen. She lay on the cold pavement, heart hammering in her chest, the adrenaline surging through her veins like an electric current. The roar of the speeding car still echoed in her ears, the moment replaying in her mind. The blur of silver, the rush of air as it missed her by inches, and the sudden, forceful impact that saved her life. She turned her head, and there he was. The boy, a kid, maybe 12, maybe younger, was lying on the ground beside her, his breath ragged, his dark hoodie torn at the sleeve. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the city that had almost swallowed them both whole. For a second, neither of them spoke, neither of them moved. Then voices started to break through the haze. "Did you see that? That car just... Someone should call the police." But no one did. People slowed down, gave them a glance, but no one stepped in. No one bent down to ask if they were okay. No one helped. Eleanor had never been ignored before, never felt small in a city that always seemed to make space for her. But now, sprawled on the sidewalk next to a kid who probably slept on these very streets, she realized something unsettling. This was his reality every day. She pushed herself up, wincing as her hands scraped against rough concrete. Her designer coat was filthy, the fabric torn at the elbow. Pain shot up from her knee. She had landed hard. Then she turned toward the boy. He was already sitting up, arms resting on his knees, head bowed slightly as he caught his breath. His clothes were thin for the biting cold, his sneakers frayed to the point of barely holding together. His skin was dark, his features sharp, but his expression, his eyes, that's what made Eleanor stop. They weren't wide with panic. They weren't desperate for help. They were resigned. As if saving someone's life wasn't the craziest thing he had done, as if he expected nothing in return. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Are you—" Her voice came out rough, unfamiliar to even herself. She cleared her throat. "Are you okay?" The boy finally looked at her, his gaze steady, calm. "I'm fine." His voice was even, controlled, like he had learned that showing weakness meant nothing out here, like pain was just a part of life. Eleanor was used to confidence. She was used to men in boardrooms speaking with authority, demanding things with power in their voices. But this was different. This wasn't confidence, it was survival. She exhaled, glancing around, as if trying to piece together the reality of what had just happened. Her phone. Where was it? She spotted it a few feet away, its screen cracked. Another thing broken today. She ignored it. Instead, she turned back to the boy. "You," she swallowed, "you saved my life." He shrugged. "You weren't looking." It wasn't an accusation. It was just the truth. Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "That car," she shook her head, still unable to process it. "If you hadn't—" "I saw it coming," he said simply. "How?" He gestured toward the street with a small nod. "You learned to pay attention." Eleanor frowned. "To what?" "Everything." The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, sent a chill down her spine. For him, danger wasn't an accident. It wasn't a one-time event. It was constant. Eleanor looked around again, expecting, what? That someone else would take over this conversation, that a crowd would gather, that a concerned stranger would step in. But this was Hollowbrook. People were already moving on. And suddenly, she was aware of how alone they were, sitting on the dirty pavement, surrounded by a city that didn't care. A flicker of something guilt gnawed at the edges of her chest. She had spent years ignoring people like him. Now she owed one her life. Eleanor reached for her bag, fingers searching inside until she pulled out her wallet. Without thinking, she grabbed a crisp $100 bill and held it out. "Here," she said, her voice steadier now, "for what you did." The boy didn't move. His gaze flicked to the money, then to her, then back to the money, and then he shook his head. Eleanor blinked. "What?" "I don't want your money." She frowned. "But I didn't do it for that." Something in his voice made her chest tighten. She had never met someone who turned down money. Not in business, not in life. Especially not someone who clearly needed it. She looked at him again, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw not just a kid, not just a street boy, but a human being. Someone who had risked his own life to save hers and didn't ask for anything in return. The weight of that realization settled in her bones like a heavy, unfamiliar burden. Her fingers curled around the bill as she pulled it back. "Then, what do you want?" The boy hesitated. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, that he would just walk away and disappear into the city again, like a ghost no one remembered seeing. But then, in a voice quieter than before, he finally spoke. "A meal. Just that. Nothing else. Not money. Not clothes. Not anything a billionaire could have easily handed over to make herself feel better. Just food." Eleanor felt something inside her shift. She had bought buildings, signed contracts worth millions, attended gala after gala, shaken hands with the wealthiest people in the world. But in that moment, standing in the middle of a city that had taught her everything about power but nothing about humanity, she realized something that made her stomach twist. She had never done something as simple as buying a meal for someone who truly needed it, and somehow she knew this was going to change everything. Eleanor Whitmore was rarely caught off guard. She had sat across tables from billionaires, politicians, CEOs, people who could shake entire economies with a single decision. She had mastered the art of staying composed, of controlling the room, of never letting emotions dictate her actions. But right now, sitting on the freezing pavement of Madison Square, staring into the unwavering eyes of a boy who had just saved her life, she found herself at a complete loss. Not because of what had happened, not because she had nearly been hit by a car, not even because she was still trembling from the sheer force of how close she had come to dying. No, it was because of him. Because when she had reached into her expensive leather bag and pulled out $100 bill, the same way she had done 1,000 times before to get rid of uncomfortable situations. He had refused it. A street kid, a boy who clearly had nothing, who probably hadn't had a full meal in days. And yet, when she had offered him money, he had looked at it the way one might look at a crumpled receipt, like it meant nothing. Eleanor swallowed, still gripping the bill between her fingers, staring at him as if she had just encountered something impossible. This wasn't how the world worked. People always wanted money. They begged for it, fought for it, some even killed for it. But this boy, he had wanted something else. A meal, he had said. His voice had been steady, not desperate, not pleading, just stating a fact. Eleanor exhaled, shaking her head slightly, trying to process everything. Her knee throbbed from the fall, her coat was ruined, and she was still cold from the wind cutting through the city streets. But for the first time in years, none of that mattered. She looked at him again, this kid in a hoodie too thin for the winter air, sneakers that barely held together, hands tucked into his pockets as if he was bracing for her reaction. "All right," she said finally, shoving the bill back into her bag. "Let's get you something to eat." Jamal blinked. Just once. No excitement, no relief. Like he had learned a long time ago not to get his hopes up. Eleanor pushed herself up, ignoring the ache in her body, and gestured toward him. "Come on." For a moment she thought he wouldn't follow, that he would turn and disappear into the city like a shadow, just another invisible person lost in a world that never looked back. But then, after a hesitation so brief she almost missed it, he stood. He didn't thank her. He didn't say a word. He just walked beside her, hands still in his pockets, like he had done this 100 times before, like he was used to people making promises and breaking them, like he was waiting for her to change her mind. Eleanor wasn't sure why, but something about that made her chest feel tight. They walked in silence. She could feel people staring. It was subtle. Just quick glances from businessmen in tailored suits, from women in designer coats, from baristas behind coffee shop windows. She had never been on this side of the equation before. People usually looked at her with admiration, with respect, sometimes even fear. But now they looked at her the way they looked at him, like she didn't belong. She ignored it, straightening her posture, tightening her grip on her handbag as they turned a corner and stepped into a restaurant. La Rue Bistro. It was a place she had been to dozens of times before, high-end but casual, the kind of place where meetings happened over overpriced espresso and plates of avocado toast. Jamal hesitated at the entrance. Eleanor noticed. He wasn't used to places like this. The warm lighting, the polished wooden floors, the smell of freshly baked bread. It was the kind of world that existed just a few feet away from where he usually stood on the streets. But it might as well have been an entirely different planet. She took a step inside. He didn't follow. She turned to him. "Are you coming?" Jamal's fingers twitched inside his hoodie pocket. His eyes flicked toward the tables, the people, the waiters in crisp uniforms moving smoothly between guests. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. Eleanor did something then that she never did. She softened her voice. "It's just food," she said. "Come on." After another second of hesitation, Jamal stepped inside. The shift in the air was instant. The room, which had been filled with easy conversation and the clinking of glasses, grew just a little quieter. Heads turned. A waiter, standing near the host stand, stiffened. Eleanor caught the way his eyes scanned Jamal, the way his lips pressed together in a slight frown. She felt something inside her flare, a frustration she hadn't expected. Before the man could say anything, she spoke first. "Table for two." The waiter hesitated. "Miss Whitmore, She raised a brow. "Is there a problem?" The waiter swallowed, shaking his head quickly. Not at all. Right this way." Jamal said nothing as they followed him to a booth near the window. He didn't sit until Eleanor did. His hands stayed in his pockets, his back slightly hunched, like he was waiting to be told to leave. Eleanor picked up the menu. "Order whatever you want." Jamal didn't reach for one. His eyes moved over the words, scanning them. Then quietly he asked, "Do they have burgers?" The waiter looked like he wanted to roll his eyes. "Our burgers start at..." Eleanor cut him off. "Bring him whatever he wants." The waiter nodded stiffly and walked away. Eleanor turned back to Jamal. "You don't like menus?" she asked. He shrugged. "Don't know most of the stuff on them." Her stomach twisted. Of course he didn't. People who had to choose between food and survival didn't have the luxury of learning fine dining terms. Jamal sat back, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. Not impatiently, just aware. He was always watching, always waiting. "Why did you do it?" Eleanor asked suddenly. His fingers stilled. She didn't clarify. She didn't have to. He knew what she meant. For the first time, his expression shifted, just slightly. "I've been hungry before," he said. The words were simple, matter-of-fact, but they hit Eleanor harder than she expected, because she knew in that moment he wasn't talking about himself. He had seen hunger, he had felt it. And yet, when he saw someone else, a stranger, a woman who had walked past him without a second glance just minutes before, he didn't hesitate. She had spent years making business decisions that were calculated, strategic, self-serving. But this boy, he had risked his life for nothing, and Eleanor Whitmore, for the first time in as long as she could remember, felt something she didn't know she was still capable of. Shame. The warm air inside La Rue Bistro was thick with the scent of freshly baked bread and simmering sauces, a stark contrast to the icy wind still clinging to Jamal's hoodie. The heat prickled against his cold skin, but he barely noticed. He was too busy watching the way the waiters barely glanced at him, watching how the people at nearby tables stole quick, uncomfortable glances before turning back to their meals. Watching how Eleanor Whitmore sat across from him as if she hadn't just dragged a kid off the streets into one of the city's high-end restaurants. She acted like this was normal, like this was something she did every day. But Jamal knew better. People like her didn't sit across from kids like him. She might have offered him a meal, but that didn't mean she was comfortable. She kept smoothing out the fabric of her ruined designer coat, glancing around as if she wasn't sure why she was still here. The woman looked put together, powerful, but there was a tension in her hands, a restlessness in the way she adjusted her posture every few seconds, like she was fighting the urge to run back to her world. Jamal had seen it before. Rich people acted like they wanted to help, but they never stuck around long enough to understand what that actually meant. His stomach growled loudly. Eleanor looked up. "You haven't eaten yet today, have you?" Jamal hesitated, then shrugged. "Not since yesterday." Her lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't sure why. That bothered her, but it did. The waiter returned, setting down a steaming plate of food in front of him, a burger with crispy golden fries on the side. The smell hit him like a punch to the gut. His fingers twitched, itching to grab it, to eat fast before someone changed their mind. But old habits died hard. He kept his face neutral, waiting. Eleanor picked up her fork, taking a slow, deliberate bite of her salad. That was his cue. He picked up the burger, took the first bite, and almost groaned out loud. It was warm, juicy, real, not a half-eaten sandwich from the trash, not cold, stale leftovers, not something he had to fight for. He had almost forgotten what food like this tasted like. Eleanor watched him, not in a judgmental way, but in a calculating way, like she was trying to figure something out. Jamal knew this game. People looked at him and tried to solve him like he was a math problem that didn't add up. Why was a kid like him on the streets? Where was his family? How had he ended up here? They asked the same questions, but they never stuck around for the answers. Jamal focused on his food, ignoring the weight of her gaze, until she spoke again. "You didn't want money." He swallowed his bite and looked up. "No." "Why?" He sighed, setting his burger down. "Here we go." "Because money doesn't mean anything," he said simply. Eleanor blinked, as if no one had ever dared say something so ridiculous in her presence before. "Money means everything," she corrected. Jamal smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Not out there, it doesn't," she frowned. "Of course it does." He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. "Let's say I took that $100 bill you offered me." Eleanor crossed her arms. "Go on. I take it, walk out of here. Then what?" He tilted his head. "Where am I going to spend it? Think some store on Westbury Avenue is going to let a kid like me walk in and buy a jacket with their money? Think anyone's going to break a $100 bill for me at a bodega without looking at me like I stole it?" Eleanor didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. He huffed. "Money's only useful if people let you use it." He reached for a fry, popping it into his mouth. "A meal, though, a meal is real." Eleanor was silent. Then she sighed, pressing her fingers against her temple. "That's infuriatingly logical." Jamal grinned. "Yeah, I get that a lot." For the first time, her lips twitched in something close to a smile, but it disappeared just as fast. She leaned forward slightly, eyes sharp now, focused. "So tell me, what's your story?" Jamal hesitated. There it was, the question people always asked but never really wanted the answer to. What did she expect him to say? That he had some tragic past that would make her feel justified in offering him a burger? That he had been abandoned or orphaned, or whatever story would make him more digestible to her world? Rich people liked a certain type of sadness, the kind they could sympathize with, the kind that made them feel like heroes. Jamal wasn't interested in being someone's charity project, so he shrugged. Not much to tell. Eleanor's brows knitted together, her frustration flickering just beneath the surface. "You live on the streets?" "Yeah." "Alone?" Jamal nodded. "For how long?" "Long enough." She exhaled through her nose, clearly irritated by his short answers. But what did she expect? He wasn't about to spill his life story to a woman who would forget about him by next week. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, then glanced around the restaurant. People were still staring. She straightened her back, her presence shifting from curious stranger to businesswoman in control. Jamal recognized the move. She was closing herself off again, building her walls back up. And for some reason, that bothered him. He had never cared before. Not about rich people. Not about their world. But something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the fact that she was still here, still asking questions. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't eating alone. Eleanor finished the last bite of her salad and set her fork down with a quiet clink against the plate. She studied him again, her gaze softer now, less calculating. Then, finally, she asked, "If you could have anything, anything at all, what would you ask for?" Jamal tilted. His head, another test. Rich people love tests. He could have asked for money, a warm bed, a way out, but instead he met her gaze, steady and unblinking, and said, "One more meal." Eleanor inhaled sharply, not because of what he had said, but because of how he had said it, like he already knew this was the only time someone like her would ever offer, like he knew this wasn't going to last. And for reasons she didn't understand, that truth hurt more than it should. Have. The clinking of silverware and murmured conversations filled La Rue Bistro, but at the small booth by the window, an unspoken tension settled between two people who had no reason to be sitting together. Jamal had been in a lot of places he wasn't welcome. Shelters that ran out of beds, stores where security followed him down every aisle, alleys where even other street kids didn't want him around. But nothing compared to this. This wasn't just discomfort. This was a mistake waiting to happen. He could feel it in the way people looked at him. The quick, stolen glances from businessmen in tailored suits, the tight-lipped whispers from women in pearl earrings and silk scarves, the way the waiter barely concealed his irritation every time he passed their table, like he was waiting for the exact moment Jamal would prove he didn't belong here. He had seen this play out before. Rich people liked to play hero, but only in ways that looked good on paper. They donated money to charities. They never visited, wrote checks to causes they never thought about twice. But sitting down with someone like him, that was different. Jamal had no idea what Eleanor Whitmore was trying to prove, but whatever it was, he knew it wouldn't last. He took another bite of his burger, chewing slowly, not because he wanted to savor it, but because he wasn't sure when he'd eat like this again. Eleanor, on the other hand, barely touched her food. She was watching him. Not like the others did. Not with disgust or suspicion, but with something else, curiosity, frustration maybe. Like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't even know she had started. Jamal kept his eyes on his plate. The rich didn't like being confused. And if there was one thing he had learned on the streets, it was that confusing the rich made them uncomfortable. Finally, she spoke. "Why didn't you ask for more?" Jamal looked up. "What?" She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "When I asked what you wanted, you could have said anything. A place to stay, money, a way out." She leaned forward just enough for him to see the genuine confusion in her expression. "Why just another meal?" Jamal wiped his hands on the napkin, thinking, then he shrugged. "Because I knew you'd say yes." Eleanor blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. He leaned back against the booth. "People like you. You like things you can fix quickly. One meal? That's easy. You can do that and still sleep fine tonight." He gestured around the restaurant. "But if I had asked for more, something that actually mattered, you would have hesitated." Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came out. Jamal smirked. "See? You're hesitating right now." Silence. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't telling him he was wrong, because he wasn't. Jamal had spent his life watching people, learning what made them tick. And rich people, no matter how generous they wanted to be, had limits on their kindness. They liked clean generosity, the kind that didn't follow them home. Eleanor's fingers tapped lightly against the table, her nails perfectly manicured, painted in a shade that probably had some fancy name like midnight opulence. She exhaled. "You think I wouldn't have helped?" Jamal shrugged again. "I think you don't know." Something flickered in her eyes, not anger, not offense, something else. She picked up her fork, finally taking a small bite of her salad, chewing slowly, thinking. Jamal didn't say anything else. He just let her sit with it. That's how you learn things about people, not by pushing them, but by letting them push themselves. A few minutes passed, filled only with the sound of their utensils against their plates. The tension in the air shifted, not exactly comfortable but no longer sharp. Then, just as the moment settled, a voice cut through it. "Excuse me, Miss Whitmore." Jamal knew before he even looked up. The waiter. Eleanor lifted her gaze, and there it was. That familiar, polite professional tone that rich people used when they were being told something they wouldn't like. "I apologize," the waiter continued, glancing briefly at Jamal before looking back at Eleanor. "But I'm going to have to ask your guest to leave. The words weren't rude, not exactly, but the meaning was clear. Jamal had overstayed his welcome. Eleanor's expression didn't change. "Excuse me?" The waiter hesitated, shifting slightly. "It's just that we've had complaints." Jamal didn't flinch. Of course they had. A kid like him, in a place like this. He had seen the looks, heard the whispers. It was only a matter of time before someone said something. He wiped his mouth with his napkin, ready to stand. But before he could move, Eleanor's voice came, sharp and cutting as a blade. "From whom?" The waiter hesitated. "Well, Eleanor leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her expression calm but dangerous. "Are they personally offended by his presence?" She gestured around the room. "Or are they just uncomfortable seeing something that doesn't fit into their perfect little world?" The waiter shifted, clearly not expecting resistance. Jamal stilled. This was new. No one had ever stood up for him before. Not like this. The waiter cleared his throat. "Miss Whitmore, Let me make something clear." Eleanor's voice was silk wrapped around steel. "This is my city. My name is on half the buildings in this district, which means if I decide that he stays, then he stays." The waiter paled. Jamal almost laughed. Almost. He wasn't sure if she was doing this because she cared or because she hated being told what to do. But either way, it didn't matter. Because for the first time in his life, someone had refused to let him be erased. The waiter swallowed hard. "Of course, Miss Whitmore, I apologize." He turned and walked away, stiff as a mannequin. Eleanor picked up her fork again, as if nothing had happened. "So," she said casually, stabbing a piece of lettuce. "Are you gonna finish those fries or what?" Jamal grinned. For the first time since this meal started, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Scene! The tension in La Rue Bistro hadn't fully disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating kind that pressed down on Jamal every time he walked into a place like this. It wasn't the tight-lipped silence of people waiting for him to mess up, to confirm whatever they already believed about kids like him. No. This tension was different. It was the kind that came when two people from completely different worlds collided. Not in passing, not in fleeting glances, but in a way that forced them to actually see each other. Eleanor Whitmore had just stared down a waiter for him. Jamal still wasn't sure why. He wasn't stupid. He knew rich people didn't just switch sides overnight, but this was the second time she had surprised him, and that was enough to make him stay a little longer. So, instead of walking out like he normally would, he leaned back in the booth, picked up another fry, and ate it. Slowly, like he had all the time in the world. Across from him, Eleanor took a sip of her wine, watching him with those sharp, calculating eyes. She wasn't trying to intimidate him. Not exactly. She was studying him. Jamal smirked. "You always stare at people when you eat?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Only when they make no sense to me." "Yeah?" He popped another fry into his mouth. "And what part of me confuses you the most?" Eleanor exhaled, setting down her glass. "The fact that you're sitting across from me right now." "Fair." Jamal tilted his head. "Guessing you don't usually have dinner with street kids." She didn't deny it. "I don't usually have dinner with people who risk their lives for strangers." Jamal shrugged. Didn't really think about it, just saw the car coming and moved. Eleanor rested her chin on her hand, her gaze narrowing slightly. "That's what gets me. Most people hesitate. They freeze. But you ran straight toward danger." Jamal chewed slowly, thinking. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe it's 'cause I don't really think about what happens to me, just what needs to be done." Eleanor's eyes flickered with something he couldn't name. Sympathy? No. Something deeper. Something that made her look like she was seeing him for the first time. Jamal shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to that. "All right, your turn," he said, changing the subject. "Tell me something about you." Eleanor smirked. "You already know who I am." Jamal rolled his eyes. "I know your name, and I know you're rich. That's about it." She arched a brow. "That's all you need to know." "That's usually all that matters." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then leaned back, crossing her arms. "Fine," she said. "You want to know something? I wasn't always rich." Jamal paused mid-bite. "Seriously?" She nodded. "Grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment with a single mom. She worked 2 jobs, and we still struggled to keep the lights on. I wasn't supposed to end up here." Jamal studied her face, looking for the lie. There wasn't one. He swallowed his bite. "So what happened?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I got tired of struggling, so I worked, and I didn't stop. Not for anything." Jamal could see it, the hard edges in her posture, the way she carried herself, like someone who had fought for everything she had and wasn't about to let it go. He understood that, more than she probably realized. "So," he said, resting his elbows on the table, "you remember what it's like? Being on the other side?" Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. "Of course I do," she said. Jamal nodded slowly. "Then why don't you look back?" Eleanor's breath caught, just for a second. She blinked, looking down at her plate. "I don't know what you mean," Jamal scoffed. "Yeah, you do." Silence stretched between them. Then Eleanor exhaled, pressing her fingers to her temple like she had a headache coming on. "I told you I worked for this. I fought for this. And when you spend your whole life climbing, the last thing you want to do is look down." Jamal leaned forward. "What if the people down there need help?" She flinched, like he had struck something raw. Jamal wasn't expecting that. For the first time since meeting her, Eleanor Whitmore looked uncomfortable. She cleared her throat, picking up her wineglass again, but her grip on the stem was just a little too tight. Jamal watched her for a second, then shook his head. "You know," he said, voice quieter now, "you were wrong earlier." Eleanor frowned. "About what?" Jamal leaned back. "You said I ran toward danger." She nodded. "Because you did." Jamal exhaled, shaking his head. "No." He tapped his fingers lightly against the table. "I ran toward you." Eleanor froze. Jamal kept his gaze on her, watching as the words settled. "I don't know why," he admitted, "but something told me I should, that I had to." Eleanor stayed quiet. She looked away, out the window, where Hollowbrook's city lights flickered against the dark sky. Something in her expression had changed, something vulnerable. For the first time, she looked lost. Jamal had no idea why, but he knew one thing. Whatever had just happened in her head, whatever memory, whatever thought, whatever emotion had just surfaced, it was something she had buried deep. And he had just pulled it back. Up. The air outside La Rue Bistro was colder than before. The wind had picked up, cutting through the streets like a blade, rattling against shop signs and sending stray newspapers skittering across the pavement. Jamal pulled his hoodie tighter around himself as he stepped out of the restaurant, the warmth of the meal still sitting in his stomach like a rare luxury. But it wouldn't last. It never did. Beside him, Eleanor Whitmore walked in silence, her designer coat pristine again after she had brushed off the dust and remnants of the day. But something about her wasn't as polished as before. Something had shifted. Jamal had seen it back at the table, in the way she looked at him after he told her he hadn't run toward danger, he had run toward her. It was a small crack in the perfect controlled exterior she had worn so well. And now, as they walked side by side down the busy streets of Hollowbrook, he could feel it widening. She hadn't said much since they left the restaurant. She wasn't in a rush to disappear back into her world. That alone was strange. Jamal was used to these kinds of moments. A rich person felt a rare spark of humanity, did their one good deed for the year, and then walked away feeling better about themselves. He expected her to do the same, so when she suddenly spoke, her voice softer than before, it caught him off guard. "Where do you sleep?" Jamal hesitated. He didn't like that question. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because it was never the answer people wanted to hear. He shrugged, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Wherever." Eleanor's footsteps slowed slightly. "Wherever?" Jamal sighed. "Yeah, wherever there's space, a bench, an alley, behind the laundromat on Harper Street." He stopped himself. That was too much information. He didn't owe her that. Eleanor exhaled through her nose. It wasn't a sigh of pity, not exactly. It was frustration, like she hated the answer, but knew she couldn't change it. Jamal kept walking. He was used to this part too, the moment when they realized the world wasn't as clean as they wanted it to be. But Eleanor didn't drop it. She didn't brush it off. Instead, she stopped walking. And for the first time that night, Jamal realized she wasn't going to just walk away. He turned, frowning. "What?" She was staring at him, her sharp, assessing eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before, a decision forming. "Come with me," she said. Jamal blinked. "What?" "My place. It's warm." Jamal laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "Yeah, right." She didn't laugh. She didn't even flinch. "I'm serious." Jamal shook his head. "That's not how this works, lady. You bought me a meal, you feel good about yourself, and now I go back to my life. End of story." Eleanor took a step closer, tilting her head slightly. "And what if I don't want that to be the end of the story?" Jamal narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. She could have said, "Because you saved my life." She could have said, "Because I owe you." She could have said, "Because it's the right thing to do." But she didn't. Instead, she met his gaze and said, "Because I remember what it's like to be cold." Jamal felt his throat tighten. He hated that answer. Because it wasn't fake. It wasn't some empty, rehearsed line meant to make her feel better. It was real, and real things were dangerous. He shook his head again, stepping back. "I don't need your charity." "This isn't charity." Her voice was firm. "It's an option, and from what I can tell, you don't get a lot of those." Jamal clenched his jaw. "You think one night in a warm place changes anything?" Eleanor's expression softened. "I think one night in a warm place is better than one night in the cold." He hated that answer too, because she was right. Jamal glanced around, the city buzzing with life, but he felt more alone now than he had all day. He didn't trust people. He had learned not to. But something in Eleanor's eyes made it hard to believe she was like the rest of them, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. A long silence stretched between them. Then, without realizing he was even doing it, Jamal exhaled, like a part of him had just given up fighting something inevitable. "Fine," he muttered. "One night." Eleanor didn't react, didn't gloat, didn't act like she had won something. She just nodded. One night. But as they started walking toward her car, Jamal had the sinking feeling that this wasn't going to be just one night. The penthouse was too quiet. Jamal sat on the couch, hands tucked into the sleeves of his hoodie, his body sinking slightly into the soft leather. It felt wrong. Not just the couch, but the silence. The kind of silence that only existed in places like this. Places where nothing bad ever happened, where nobody had to sleep with one eye open, where safety wasn't a question, but a fact. He wasn't used to it. Back on the streets, silence meant danger. It meant someone was watching you from the shadows, waiting for you to close your eyes just long enough to take what little you had. Here, silence just existed. Eleanor moved through the penthouse with the same quiet authority she had carried all night. She didn't hover, didn't rush him, didn't act like she was waiting for him to prove something. She had given him a shower, a warm place to sit, and now she had just let him be. That was the strangest part. Rich people didn't do that. They needed to fix things, to control the situation, to make sure they felt good about whatever good deed they had just done. But Eleanor wasn't looking at him like he was something she had to fix. She was just watching. From across the room, she poured herself a glass of wine, taking a slow sip before speaking. "You can stay here tonight," she said. Jamal didn't react. He had already heard her say that before, back when they were standing on the cold street, when she had given him the choice to come with her in the first place. But now, hearing it again, something about the words felt different, like she actually meant it, like she wasn't waiting for him to say no. Jamal exhaled, leaning back into the couch, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. He shouldn't stay. That's what his instincts told him. People changed their minds. People made promises they didn't keep. One night could turn into a morning where she looked at him differently, where she realized she had let something into her perfect world that didn't belong. He had seen it before, and yet the warmth of the penthouse wrapped around him like something dangerous, like something he wanted but didn't trust. Eleanor watched him, waiting. She wasn't pushing, wasn't rushing. She was giving him space, and Jamal hated how much that made him want to stay. Finally, he sighed. "Where am I supposed to sleep?" Eleanor set down her glass, walking toward the hallway. "Guest room is down here." Jamal stood slowly, his feet too quiet, against the expensive hardwood floors. He followed her, eyes flicking around the hallway as she opened a door and stepped aside. The room inside was massive, a bed that looked bigger than the entire alley he used to sleep in. A dresser, a closet, a window with a view of the city that stretched out into the night. It was too much. Jamal didn't move. Eleanor crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "It's just a bed." Jamal glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, that's the problem." Eleanor frowned, studying him. Then after a moment she sighed and gestured toward the couch in the living room. "Fine. Take the couch if you want." Jamal let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She wasn't pushing him. That mattered. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the living room, dropping onto the couch like he had always belonged there. Eleanor didn't argue. She just nodded, picked up her wine glass again, and walked away. No expectations, no rules, just a couch, a warm place, a night without the cold. Jamal pulled the blanket over himself, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in a long, long time, he let his eyes close without fear. The first thing Jamal noticed when he woke up was the warmth. For a split second, his body tensed, his mind still trapped in the survival instincts of sleeping outside, where the cold was an enemy that never let up. But then he remembered. The penthouse, the couch, Eleanor Whitmore. Jamal blinked at the high ceiling above him, at the soft light filtering through the massive windows. The city stretched beyond the glass in a golden glow, skyscrapers standing tall against the early morning sky. It felt unreal. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't his world. His world was pavement and alleyways, doorways where he could tuck himself away from the wind, shelters that were always too full. His world was moving before dawn, keeping his head down, never getting comfortable. But right now he was warm. The scent of coffee drifted through the air, pulling him out of his thoughts. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, glancing toward the kitchen. Eleanor was already awake, standing by the stove, a cup in one hand and her phone in the other. She was dressed in something sharp and expensive looking, her hair pulled into a neat bun, back straight, posture perfect. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who owned this city. And yet, the moment she glanced at him, something in her expression softened. "Morning," she said simply. Jamal stretched, rolling his shoulders. "You rich people always wake up this early?" Eleanor smirked, taking a sip of her coffee. "You learn to function on very little sleep when you run an empire." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? Well, I learned to function on very little sleep because I didn't want to get robbed." Eleanor actually laughed at that, a real, genuine laugh. Not forced, not polite, just real. Jamal blinked. He wasn't used to hearing rich people laugh like that. Eleanor set down her coffee and gestured toward the counter. "I made extra eggs if you want." Jamal hesitated. He wasn't used to this, waking up somewhere safe, having food waiting for him, someone offering without expecting anything in return. His instinct told him to refuse, to say he wasn't hungry, even though he was. But he had learned something about Eleanor last night. She didn't like being lied to, so instead of arguing, he slid off the couch, walking toward the kitchen. He expected her to hand him a plate and be done with it. But instead, she grabbed another mug and poured him a cup of coffee, setting it down in front of him before sliding the plate over. Jamal frowned at the cup. "I don't drink coffee." Eleanor smirked. "Learn." Jamal rolled his eyes but took the plate anyway, sitting on one of the bar stools. He tried to eat slow, but his body had other ideas. The eggs were warm, buttery, perfectly cooked. The toast was crunchy in a way he hadn't tasted in years. He had spent most of his life scarfing down food before someone could take it away. Here, there was no rush. And that was the strangest thing of all. Eleanor sat across from him, still sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone. But she wasn't ignoring him. She was just existing next to him, like this was normal, like he belonged here. Jamal swallowed his last bite and wiped his mouth with the napkin. "All right," he said, leaning back, arms crossed. "What now?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jamal gestured around the penthouse. "This. You don't just bring some kid off the street, feed him, and then, what? Send him back outside?" Eleanor set down her cup. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Jamal had spent his whole life figuring people out, learning their patterns, understanding what they really meant when they spoke. But Eleanor Whitmore, she was hard to read. Finally, she sighed. "You ever hear of survivor's guilt?" Jamal frowned. "The thing where people feel bad for making it out of something?" Eleanor nodded, fingers tapping lightly against her mug. "I lived it for years. When I finally got out of the life I grew up in, I thought I had won, that I had beaten the system. But the more I built, the more I looked back and realized..." She trailed off, exhaling. "I didn't beat the system. I just learned how to survive it better than most." Jamal stayed quiet because he knew that feeling, the anger, the guilt, the constant question of why me? Why did I make it when others didn't? He had seen kids just like him disappear overnight. Some to the foster system, some to the streets, some to places worse than either. And every day he had asked himself, how much longer until it's me? Eleanor must have seen something in his face because her voice softened. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I didn't bring you here because I wanted to fix you. I brought you here because..." She hesitated, searching for the right words. Jamal leaned forward slightly, and then she said something that hit him harder than anything else had all night. "Because I don't think you should have to survive alone." Jamal's throat tightened. He hated that answer because it was real. She wasn't offering him charity. She wasn't making him feel like a project. She wasn't treating him like someone who was broken. She was just offering something he had never been given before, a choice. Jamal sat back, fingers gripping the edge of his plate. His whole life had been spent waiting for people to take things away from him. But Eleanor, she was offering something instead, and he had no idea what to do with that. The weeks passed like pages turning in a book Jamal had never expected to be part of. At first, he had tried to convince himself that it was temporary, that Eleanor would wake up one morning, look at him and change her mind, decide that he was too much of a risk, too far removed from her world, too impossible to fit into the neat, calculated life she had built. But she never did. She never made him feel like he had an expiration date. And that was the hardest part to get used to. One evening, Jamal stood by the massive glass windows of the penthouse, staring down at the city below. Hollowbrook looked different from up here, less like a monster waiting to swallow him whole, more like a puzzle of lights and movement stretching out into the night. He had spent his whole life at street level, looking up. Now he was up here, looking down. It didn't feel real. "You're quiet," Eleanor said from behind him. Jamal smirked, not turning around. "You say that like it's unusual." She stepped beside him, wineglass in hand, her reflection flickering in the window. "You've been thinking about something." Jamal exhaled through his nose, shoving his hands in his hoodie pockets. "I've been thinking about how weird this is." Eleanor arched a brow. "This?" He turned to her, gesturing around. "Yeah, all of it. I mean, look at me. I've been here for weeks, sleeping on your couch, eating your food, walking around in clothes that don't even belong to me. What am I even doing? You're here." Eleanor tilted her head. "You tell me," Jamal scowled. "Don't do that," she smirked. "Do what?" "Turn my own questions back on me," she shrugged. "It works." Jamal huffed, looking back at the city. "I don't know, okay? I don't know what I'm doing here." He hesitated. "But I don't want to leave." It was the first time he had said it out loud, and it felt huge. He expected Eleanor to react, to say something snarky, to make a comment about how he was finally admitting what they both already knew. But she didn't. She just nodded, taking another sip of her wine, giving him space to sit with the truth of his own words. Jamal exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "This ain't normal, you know." Eleanor smiled, just a little. "Normal is overrated," Jamal snorted. "Easy for you to say. Your not normal includes a billion-dollar empire and a view of the city from the top floor." She turned to him, leaning one hip against the window frame. "And your not normal includes surviving things most people wouldn't last a day in." Jamal met her gaze, something shifting between them. She wasn't saying it out of pity. She wasn't romanticizing his struggles. She was just acknowledging them, like they mattered, like he mattered. Jamal looked down at his sneakers, the new ones Eleanor had given him last week after noticing the soles of his old ones were practically disintegrating. He had almost refused them, but she hadn't given him the chance. She had just left them by the couch and walked away. No speech, no expectations, just a choice, like everything she had given him. He swallowed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "You really don't expect anything from me?" Eleanor sighed, setting her glass down on the side table. "Jamal." He looked up. She crossed her arms, her voice softer now, more honest. "You're not a debt to be repaid." Jamal's breath caught. He had spent his whole life feeling like one, like he owed the world something for letting him exist, like every favor came with invisible chains, like survival was a bargain he had to negotiate every single day. But Eleanor, she didn't ask for anything, didn't expect him to grovel or prove his worth. She had just made space for him. And that That was terrifying. Jamal cleared his throat, glancing back at the city. I still don't know what I want to do. Eleanor smirked. Good. That means you have choices. Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. You always got to spin things into some deep, rich person wisdom, huh? Eleanor laughed. It's a habit. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't the awkward kind. It was the kind that felt like understanding. Jamal exhaled, running a hand over his head. All right, he muttered. Guess I'm sticking around for a while. Eleanor smirked. Guess you are. Jamal narrowed his eyes at her. You planned this, didn't you? She raised a brow. I have no idea what you're talking about. Jamal huffed, shaking his head, but there was a small, almost smile on his lips. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running from something. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was running towards something instead. So now let me ask you, how often do you truly see the people around you? How many times have you walked past someone struggling, assuming their story was already written? Jamal didn't just save Eleanor's life, he changed it. And she did the same for him. Not with money, not with charity, but with something far more powerful. A chance. So what about you? Are you looking for a chance to change your life? Or maybe to change someone else's? Drop a comment below. What part of this story hit you the hardest, and how do you define kindness? And hey, if you want more powerful, life-changing stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.